Welcome to Conversations on Culture and Belief. We've done a series of videos now. We did one on the Formula of Concord, we did one on the Decalogue, and now we're doing one on postmodernism and questions that pertain to it. I guess that was not as clicky as of a title for this particular series. So we're going culture and belief out of the three series that we've done during coronavirus. This is certainly the one where I will be playing more the role of host than ever before. The other two, I felt like I had at least some degree of knowledge where I could have some input. I'm sure I'll say things, but I might actually be asking genuine questions because I feel like Scott knows more about this than I do, and I certainly know Bruce knows loads and loads more about this than I do, and so I will be playing the role of probably more the layman in this conversation. So the first video, which we're doing right now, is we're gonna set the stage sort of so people know what we're talking about as we answer future questions. And so the question is, what is postmodernism, and what exactly is it that we're talking about, and what is sort of the underlying current of these other questions that we're answering?
I think Bruce should go first, mainly because he can lay, I think, the, I guess I'd say, philosophical framework for how this kind of became a movement. And then I'd be happy to come in and give my observations on culturally how we interact with this.
Yeah, so the question, what is postmodernism, is, of course,
an anti-postmodern
question. But I will tell you at the onset, before I begin to try to define that for you, that the very nature of what postmodernism is resists answering that question, which is why postmodernism can be incredibly frustrating to some and incredibly fascinating to others. So I'll begin by just picking apart the word postmodernism, after modernism, or after modernity. So scholars like to take history and they like to put it into chunks of ideologies, things like the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and modernism is one of those kind of ideological, philosophical periods or epochs as they define the history of modern thinking, philosophy, and thought. Postmodernism makes it sound like it's after this period of modernism. By the way, we're in modernism now. But postmodernism doesn't actually literally mean after modernism. It is a movement within modernism that seeks to critique modernism as being somewhat too into itself. So before we can really talk about postmodernism, we have to have a very quick discussion on what modernism is. Modernism tends to come out of the period known as the Enlightenment. And without getting too complex or getting too down a rabbit trail, the Enlightenment believed that all humans could come together because of their reasoning powers, that they all had universal reason, and that this universal reason, when put to best use, could find the truth, the reality in things. And so the Enlightenment assumed that the best way for humans to order their societies and to live their lives was by a sort of collective working together through the universal trait of reason. And because of this, there was an anxiety that modernism had, and there was a solution that modernism had. The anxiety was that you didn't want to concentrate power anywhere, and you wanted to jettison traditions. You didn't want to believe that something was true just because you've always done it that way. Traditions tend to be authoritative. You do things because you're supposed to. But modernism and Enlightenment thinking came along and said, no, you should do things because they're reasonable. And the best way we're going to find a consensus on reason is if we separate concentrated power. So you get things like human rights, the power of the individual and the self, separation of powers in government systems. Because if you don't have a centralized power, people can all use their reason collectively and come to the best and same, that's an important part, conclusion about truth. Well, one of the problems that soon starts to develop out of modernism is that it believed that because you would have this universal reason and everyone would be working together and power would be divided and traditions wouldn't carry weight in and of themselves, that we would have a sort of moral and technological progress, that humanity would become better and better. But the history of the 20th century blew that completely out of the water. You had things like all the different wars, World War I, World War II, Korea, name them, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Iraq, you can go on and on and on. You had race wars. You had all sorts of violations of human rights. You had the leftovers of imperialism, all sorts of problems. So people began to become skeptical of the claims of modernism. And out of that skepticism came what we now know as postmodernism. But
So Bruce,
postmodernism,
can I come in for a second here? When I do this to sort of groups of lay people in churches, one of the things I give as an example is the sort of hyper positivity in America that was seen after World War II. America is seen as, or at least sees itself culturally as sort of the shining power that through the force of modern politics and the force of modern technology and just the force of sheer power and having truth and justice and the American way on their side won the war against these sort of evil powers. And in America, this plays out in a baby boom. It does worldwide, really, but in America, it plays out in a baby boom, and it plays out in all this great new scientific technology making its way from, the military and the factories into the homes. You have refrigeration and air conditioning and all these things that make life better. And this is when you get TV shows, that sort of exude this sense during this time. Leave It to Beaver, Wait Till Your Father Gets Home, all this other stuff that I certainly don't remember, but I've seen in reruns for sure. And every guy, whether he's going to go work in the garage for the day or go to the office, gets up and puts on at least a shirt and a jacket. Every woman wears the beautiful day dress or sundress every day, and we got the 2.5 children, and everybody's smiling. And it just seems like everything's right, and you have an opinion on everything, and that opinion is decisive, right? It's the truth, and what you're seeking is the truth. And then the whole time there's sort of this undercurrent of, the 3 martini lunch to get you through this paradise every day. And along come sort of the beat generation initially, and then the hippies, and then the yippies, and then on and on and on, that begin to question this sort of facade of truth, justice, and the American way, certainly. Begin to question sort of the Leave It to Beaver life as, is this even real? And you can sort of culturally see this tension. You could just see it through TV shows, to be honest with you. But if you're a student of American history at all, you can definitely see this shift that occurs between sort of the 10-year-ish period after World War II to the beginning of the Beat generation in the mid to late 50s, and certainly then into the generations that challenged everything with the baby boomers themselves and the hippies in the 60s on into the 70s. And then you just get the absolute, it was sort of from political certainty and cultural certainty during this time, going from Truman and on to just the chaos that comes even with the assassination of an American president and his brother and civil rights leaders, and just absolute chaos seems to come on the heels. And I think a lot of what you're saying here, this idea that modernism has a optimistic outlook that's founded in reason, but it's really found, I think really is founded in certainty, quote unquote certainty of a sense, begins to get challenged. So I just wanted to sort of throw a cultural touch point in there for people.
No, that's really helpful, and I would agree with everything you've said there. Even like you said, the post-war era, and particularly in America, was a period of increased prosperity, which led to all sorts of changes. And World War II was really the continuation of World War I, because World War I was the Empire War.
Yeah.
It was fought between empires. When World War I ended, empires ended, and they literally just took markers and they just divided up the world with no thinking of cultural and ideological differences, and that boiled over eventually in World War II. So this idea that you could just reason your way to peace just kept leading to more wars. And it also led to all sorts of racial problems, economic income problems. You had cold wars, you had actual wars. And so scholars began, particularly in France, postmodernism is a collective philosophy. It works all over the world, but its kind of high point started out of France, where a bunch of philosophers in the 50s and 60s began to critique this idea that we could have progress. And that, in fact, what was at work in modernism was modernism itself had become another tradition in and of itself. Remember, modernism says you can't trust traditions, you got to trust reason. But postmodern thinkers began to say, but this idea that reason is universal and that you can have certainty in it is itself a tradition. And therefore, modernism hasn't escaped what it was trying to do. So then what is postmodernism? How can we define it? Well, let's try to define it by thinking about what its anxiety is, what it's really afraid of. Jean-Francois Lyotard is one of the famous postmodern philosophers who probably has given postmodernism its most accepted definition. You have to excuse this definition because I have to explain it, but it's very, very popular, and so it's important to know if we talk about the subject. Lyotard said that postmodernism is incredulity towards meta-narratives. Incredulity towards meta-narratives.
Well, of course it is.
If you hate that language, you will not like reading anything in postmodernism, because postmodernism loves jargon. We can talk about why at another time. What Lyotard is saying is this. A meta-narrative is simply a fancy word for a big story that gives meaning to your life. So incredulity to meta-narratives would mean that postmodernism rejects any story that gives full meaning to your life. For example, Christianity is a meta-narrative because it answers in its telling of reality everything there is to know about what it means to be a human. It has an answer for that. Science, humanism, are also meta-narratives. Any religious system is a meta-narrative. Any philosophy is a meta-narrative. Any story from which you can derive meaning from your life in a definitive way, this is the way to go, this is the path, that would be a meta-narrative. And postmodernism rejects them all. Go ahead.
I was going to say, so in the context of the example I gave, in the 50s, and even, as we progress with this into the 60s, there's this sort of theme in American culture and American politics is that democracy is good and communism's bad, right? And this leads us into wars of containment, right, in Korea and Vietnam, where we're trying to contain the spread of communism, because it's so true from the, I guess I'd say, modernist American political perspective of the time, that communism is bad or evil, or as Ronald Reagan called it, the USSR, the evil empire. That we have to fight wars over this. We have to sacrifice lives over to stop the spread of this thing. That's how important it is. Postmodernism would come along, I think, and say, yeah, that's too much of a universal descriptor of good and evil as applied to something that can control your life, as in democracy versus communism. Am I wrong? Right?
Correct. So
yeah.
Postmodernism shares with modernity the distrust of authority. But what postmodernism says is that trust in reason turns reason into an authority that can become just as domineering and oppressive and tyrannical as any other centralized authority. And the history of the 20th century is cited as evidence of that fact, that It was universal reason that led to eugenics. It was universal reason that led to Jim Crow laws. It was universal reason that led to slavery. It was universal reason that led to the Cold War. It was universal reason that led to the space race. It was universal reason that led to privatizing religion so that it couldn't be in the public sphere anymore. The claim to reason as a sort of be-all, end-all authority ideology is heavily critiqued in postmodernism. There are very, what would be the word? Very precise and detailed critiques, and there are many famous ones on how that works out in postmodernism, which we may or may not have time to get into. But to just understand the basic point. So postmodernism believes that with modernism, that there's a fear of authority. But postmodernism goes back before modernism to pre-modernism and actually takes something from there. So on the one hand, it says, hey, modernism, you were right. I don't trust authority either. But here's the thing, modernism, you don't trust traditions. As postmoderns, we say they are inevitable. You can never get out of traditions. There's no escaping them. You think in a tradition. Your language is already situated in a tradition. You can't not think in traditions. If you're a Western white American male or a Eastern female, that automatically is going to condition how you are in the world. That doesn't mean you can't think about what it might be like to be different or something else. I'm not rejecting that. But you already stand in a thought tradition, a philosophical tradition that you've inherited, and that has a complex genealogy to it of thought. And you can't get out of it. Any thought you have on what the world is really about, what reality is about, what God is about, is simply you moving from one tradition to another. You can't ever escape out of traditions and come up with something completely new, because anything new is just a sort of buffet line amalgamation of things that already are. And so on the one hand, we reject authority, but on the other hand, unlike modernism, we admit we can't escape traditions. So what does that mean? Well, that means that if we can't escape traditions and we don't trust authority, then the best thing that we can do is that we can try to not close any of our systems down. In other words, we want to stop anyone from saying that they have access to universal truth.
And that is where most people get uncomfortable with this. I mean, that is where I think postmodernism gets to dig, that it's all relativism, that it denies truth claims in general. And I actually think most people who think of themselves as modernists would be surprised to hear you say that sort of formal modernism rejects traditions, because I think most modernists would sort of see themselves as the defenders of tradition.
But isn't it, Scott? Isn't that kind of how this works? I mean, when I think back to, not that I was there, but when I talk to people from the previous generation, or you watch TV shows like you were saying, or films, or this sort of thing. There's like there may not be a better word than traditional.
Yeah,
as you watch it, right? You're like, well, that's very traditional American whatever, right? Family life. Like you said, the guys are all dressed the same. The women are all dressed the same. And it seems like what postmodernism is saying is that you could be sort of bucking against tradition, but once you sort of, you're saying like close that circle, close that system, you inevitably find yourself in one, and then the answer to why is this the best is just, well, it just is. This is the way we do it, right? And you have then like set up the tradition, and because when you look at it, that's what it looks like, right? You're like, that's pretty traditional.
I think, and Bruce can correct me, I think how we interact with postmodernism versus modernism is we react with it as traditionalists, as opposed to sort of like the new crazy people. And the reason for that is, and I think what the point is, Bruce is trying to get across here, is that somebody, whether they're formally or in, and I guess I would use these categories, whether they're formally or informally sort of postmodern. And I think most people that are informally, they couldn't give you the history that Bruce just gave you. They wouldn't know the philosophers. They wouldn't know the movement itself. They just sort of interact with things differently than their parents or their grandparents do. And I think one of the big things that I appreciate about postmodernism as a movement is it sort of encourages you to check your priors. And by that, I mean, with their acknowledgement that we all interact with tradition as the same kind of thing as saying we all come into seeking out truth claims with preconceived ideas of what the answer is going to be. And our traditions are what cause us to have those preconceived ideas. So none of us really seek out, I'm saying this as, playing devil's advocate here, people, don't freak out on me in the comments. None of us actually go into seeking out a truth claim blind or, tabula rasa with a blank slate. We all are coming into this with a bunch of categories that our experience and the traditions that we were brought up in or whatever have influenced us. And that makes truth, capital T truth, universal truth, as Bruce said, a very difficult thing to find because you never really know when you've let go of enough of your preconceived ideas that they haven't impacted your data or your how you put the data together in order to get that truth claim. I mean, it's in a lot of ways, it's the sort of researcher's conundrum is how do I keep in check enough of my priors to actually research a question impartially. And I think somebody who's steeped in postmodernism would say, well, you never will.
Yeah. So it is important for us to maybe also be very clear about what we mean by modernity being an anti-traditional project. Modernity has to be an anti-traditional project because it believes in progress. So it can't, by virtue of what it's trying to do, because it believes the world is getting better and better through universal reason, it has to jettison anything that's traditional that doesn't agree with universal reason. So it has no claim and no loyalty to traditions. Postmodernism does have loyalty to traditions because postmodernism says what modernism has done is it has said to you, Christians, you need to get rid of your traditions and get better and change. And postmodernism says, no, you absolutely do not.
But you can't go walk around making claims like they claim about absolute truth.
What you can't do, what no one can do, Christians or anybody else, is claim that their narrative, their telling, their story
is
the only story. Because in order to do that, you would have to close out, destroy the other systems that exist in belief. And that would do two things. First, it would create a universal authoritative narrative. And we don't like authority in postmodernism. That's what we share with modernism. So if you have one story that tells the truth of everything, you have a centralized authority. That's a problem. Two, by embracing traditions and allowing them to exist on their own, postmodernism is actually in the process of rejecting that universal truth is something that could be known. So this is a very important distinction in postmodernism. Postmodernism isn't arrogant enough to say there isn't universal truth.
Yeah, I agree with that.
It claims that no one can know it.
Yeah.
And that anyone who says they do is trying to use power politics to shut out opposing voices.
I always see this as a little bit of hyper-empiricism with some weird sociology sprinkled in.
There's a lot of sociology in it, too.
I mean, this is just like, empirically, I would never say I can get to this sort of capital T in all-encompassing truth. I can just give you the conclusions that the data has fed me, and I'm open via inquiry to those conclusions being changed if new evidence presents itself, right? And so thus I'm not making to you a mathematical proposition that's always true. And I don't even need to hear in the comments about, all the math that would show that, all this theory going on, but just generally, just roll with me here, people. but then there's this sociological part that comes in with postmodernism. It's like, but if you do make a claim, you're making that claim because of some sort of power politic move that you have to make that protects something that's yours and or some tradition that you're trying to defend or something like that. And that's the part of this that's just so interesting to me, because I think it's what helps people engage this, not as what it started out to be, which is sort of, I guess I'd say an academic movement that more than strictly philosophical. And it just has become sort of political in a lot of ways. What the funny thing is it's sort of the difference these days as we interact with it between a quote unquote modernist and a postmodernist really is going to be between a traditionalist in a sense, right? Somebody who sort of wants that clinging for what we once had when we believed in the greatness of America, or when we believed in
very nostalgic.
Yeah, right. Very nostalgic in that.
Just the greatness of the West in general, right?
Right. Yeah. As opposed to somebody who's like, well, no, that was never true. And we see those people sort of on the other side of the political spectrum, and they seem to always be sort of changing, right? Goes from power politics to identity politics to whatever. And we see that as the postmodern move. And I just think it's so interesting because as you've laid it out, neither one of these camps is a purist of either position, right? A purist of either position would have sort of much cleaner lines. I just got finished reading a book by Ross Douthat on decadence. I forgot the exact title of it, but it's on decadence. And it's interesting to me that he makes basically the argument that, and he doesn't really get into this postmodernism versus postmodernism thing, but basically the argument that progress, which you would see, I would define as sort of a modernist value, progress ceased around the 60s. And really that from then on, we've been in sort of fine-tuning mode and sort of recycling mode. And as an example from technology, right, it's in the 30s, 40s, and 50s that we bring sort of gas-powered ovens into the house. And this revolutionizes cooking in the home. We get to electric ovens too, but whatever. We bring in ovens into the house that we no longer have to go chop down trees and split wood and manually feed in order to get what we need to cook our food. But since then, in all the years since that invention, we still have the same thing, ovens, usually gas or electrically powered, in our homes. And the only progress we've made is that if our Alexa's working and the internet's connected correctly, we can tell our oven to turn on instead of go turn the knob. And he's like, that's not actually progress. That's decadence. And I think that there's an interesting interplay here, because while it's technically the modernists who hold progress as a value, I think that if you were to ask a person on the street, they would attribute that to somebody who's, I don't even know if they know the categories, but that they would conceive of as postmodern, right? Because those seem to be the categories that are always changing, politically, socially. If you look at it, the gay marriage debate is kind of politically over, but that was a real progressive move, right? And the LGBT sort of movement is a real progressive move, and I don't think that's something that anybody would attribute to sort of, and it's going to drive you crazy, traditional modernism. But more to sort of like liberal progressivism / postmodernism. I think if you were to talk to some of the people that do like cultural commentary in my church, the LCMS, there's no way they'd attribute that to modernism. They would say that's very much postmodern move. I think what you gave us is helpful, because we have a perception of this that's possibly historically not accurate.
Bruce,
I think there's a bias that I don't blame anyone for, that postmodernism is progressivism. There's an equal sign there. That's not really true. Why that tends to play itself out that way is because postmoderns, the academics who really gave us postmodernism, tend to be progressive people. But if you take the philosophy in and of itself. Postmodernism, in many ways, is a much safer ideology for the preservation of Christian rights in the West than modernism could be. Because if modernism could prove that Christianity is inherently dangerous to the human rights and good of the world, then universal reason would say Christianity needs to go away.
That's right.
Postmodernism is a tradition that's going to say, no, you can't destroy other traditions just because you don't agree with them. You can't get rid of traditions. So you can't use your tradition of universal reason to stomp out another tradition, because your tradition actually isn't more valid than any other tradition, because there's no access to a universal truth. There is access to, now that doesn't mean that reason doesn't play at all in postmodernism. Certainly argument, debate, inquiry, all those things, convincing people about ideology and what they should believe, proselytization is all fine. Postmodernists don't have a problem with that. It's the closure. It's the saying that my way is the right way and your way is the wrong way, is where the postmodern anxiety is, which is why postmodernists often will classify their project as a justice project. They bring justice to the underdog. What the term they use, which most people now are familiar with in the vernacular, but came out of postmodern thought, was the other. The one who is either oppressed or is so out of the picture they don't even exist. Now, I'll use an inflammatory example of this for most of our audience. Non-binary gender. No one would have thought of that even as a category. Like, it didn't occur to most people. And then Judith Butler and a couple other progressives came along. And Judith Butler isn't technically a postmodern. She's a progressivist, but she falls within a postmodern camp. And she said, no, actually gender's fluid. It's not fixed. What a postmodern reading of that would be is Judith Butler helped us see that there was a community of people who saw themselves and their gender as completely outside of any of the commonly prescribed narratives. And at any time those people would try to, I'm using postmodern language, emerge into public consciousness and say, this is who we are, they would be shut out or oppressed. And postmodernism will instantly cling to those people and say that community has an equal share to exist and to promote themselves. What that community does not have a right to do is say that their view of non-binary fluid gender should be the view everyone should adapt. That's where people get confused with postmodernism.
Is that the breakdown between like someone who's just like a strictly progressive and someone who's like a true postmodernist? Because a progressive might say
solid postmodern would stop short of saying that everyone has to believe in a gender fluid or non-binary view of gender, because to do so would be oppressive.
What's interesting,
however, one last point. Postmodernism does believe, though, that you should empower and support the minority voices, because only the powerful can help them get a hearing. They can't get a hearing in and of themselves. So you need power to be shared with them. And that's where the progressivism of postmodernism tends to get conflated, is that postmodernism's ethics say, if you truly believe what postmodernism says about justice and about truth, then you should be supporting the promotion of these people's existence and right to promote themselves, even if you don't make the extra move at saying everyone has to believe them. So there's a lot of very fine nuances in postmodernism, which makes it easy for people to accuse them of being relativist or of just kind of being crazy. And I think it's a terrible misreading of them. Lastly, just to your point, Scott, earlier, with turning everything political. From a postmodern perspective, everything is political. That is ideological.
Oh, I agree with that. And here's the thing that I think is just excessively frustrating from my perspective, is that so much of this has been adopted by political progressivism. But at the same time, political progressivism historically is a modernist movement. It's about progress, right? And that progress is tied to science and to inquiry. Sort of much of the scientism that I would say I bemoan today to some degree. Not that I'm very much pro-science. I'm very much anti-scientism. has to do with sort of this absolute universalizing of what starts out as postmodern acknowledgments, say about non-binary genders, right? Absolutely, in our current political climate, if you say that this is not a thing, you will be jumped on as a bigot, right?
Right.
If you do not universally accept this, you'll be jumped on as some sort of monster that's, from a prior time.
The reason why you would be jumped on is specifically by postmodern is because you would be by disagreeing with that, you could be perceived as using your power to do exactly what postmodernism has a problem with, to shut out voices that need to emerge and have the right to exist.
Here comes the problem. And that's all fine, but I don't have to believe it, right? And within postmodernism, strictly speaking, I'm okay not believing it.
Correct.
But as we've sort of engrafted this into cultural ethics, I'm not okay not believing it. And this is the problem. And I think this is where many sort of conservative Christians, why they get so negative on postmodernism. It's not just the relativism thing. It's how it's been sort of co-opted to not only give disempowered people power, but to disempower people who have been perceived to be in power and don't agree with it. And I think that this is the struggle. I really do. I think the struggle here isn't that the philosophy of postmodernism isn't ever helpful. I think there's points where it is helpful. I think that it's, and we'll do an episode on certainty. I think its critique of certainty is a good critique. It's not that I'm uncertain of certain things, including that Jesus Christ is God and man and is my Savior, and that certainty has many other applications. I am. But applying that to certainty in all things that are perceived to be Christian via tradition, I think has been problematic in the past and currently. And so I think that one of the things I hope we can do with this series is sort of flush out sort of both sides of the coin for some of these issues. And I think it's helpful. It's helpful to know the history because it's helpful to know where to critique this thing accurately. And where to praise it accurately. Now, I do think we'll get some crap for praising it at all. But in my, in looking into this myself to a lesser degree than you have, I think I'm an empiricist, and I think as an empiricist, there's some attractive things here. I think there's some attractive ways at looking at certainty and truth. And I don't agree with the idea that every meta-narrative is false. For one big reason that itself is a meta-narrative, but that's fine. But other than that, I think questioning meta-narratives is a good thing because culturally, societally, in America, we've held some very questionable meta-narratives in the past that have been shown to be untrue. Something that helps us to get to the point where we don't just blindly accept a meta-narrative because it has been previously held is a good thing.
Yeah, there's a scholar named Gavin Hyman who works in postmodernism, and they point out that, first they quote another scholar named John Milbank, who's made this critique that you just made. Milbank says, postmodernism is all fine and well, except for the fact that it says there's no such thing as great big narratives, but that is a narrative about narratives. But Hyman points out, not in contra to Milbank, but to sort of hedge him in and to show that Milbank doesn't quite have the trump card in saying that, that it's probably best to think about what postmodernism is, because postmodernism isn't unaware of that critique and has been from the very beginning. Postmodernism can deconstruct itself. And so what Hyman says we should do is we should see postmodernism as saying, let me back up. So postmodernism says there's no such thing as meta-narratives. Hyman says what we should probably do is critique postmodernism by saying maybe the best thing we can hope for is to move through meta-narratives. So where we don't outright reject them, and yet we don't outright embrace them. And Gavin Hyman believes that theology is the only thing capable of actually helping society do this. That theology is the only, because any meta-narrative is a human construct. Catholicism, Lutheranism, Episcopalianism, even the denominational things are themselves human-created narratives based on divine truth. But unless you're willing to say that every other denomination is wrong and yours is right, then you have to somewhat admit that they're constructed in a narrative. And so Hyman will simply say, theology is best primed to handle balance this work of meta-narratives. It doesn't need the anxiety to embrace them as the only truth, and it doesn't need to jettison them, on the other hand. Theology can sort of hold them all close, preferring some and kind of keeping others distant, because it's always in interaction with the Lord and the Spirit. And therefore, because the Lord is truly the only truth, as the T fully means anything, the high T truth, then the Spirit is always working on the church, correcting it, working on its people, sanctifying it for God's own glory. And therefore, theology is most prime because it's always humbled in reference to the Lord and the Spirit to correcting itself, but it's not willing to jettison the meta-narratives. I find that a plausible and inviting sort of way to think about it.
It's one of the reasons I think Lutheranism is the only correct meta-narrative, because it's an open system in that way. I mean, it's theologically open to the evidence, you know, and at least the tradition that I'm trained in is, or was in many cases, open to the evidence, right? And which means that if you're calling Lutheranism, first of all, Lutheranism would bemoan calling itself a system at all. But insofar as it is a system, it is open to the parts of that system being challenged by the evidence. Now, we think we've got much of it on lock, right? But at the same time, you know, somebody brought something to me, and you know, there were better manuscripts, and the exegesis of passages there showed that this needed to be adjusted or that needed to be adjusted. I'd be open to it. And this is sort of historically been the case. I would say, just for the sake of saying it, if we consider sort of the teachings of Christ as the meta-narrative, if he truly is God, that's the one meta-narrative that we don't pass through in this, right? That's the one that is the truth. If the truth became incarnate and dwelt among us and spoke, then that is the truth. And if he's saying things that are universally applicable, and you know, that thus meta, that is true. But that's the primary, I think in this discussion, that's the primary question that has to be answered, right? Who was this Jesus? Did he claim to be God? If he did that claim show to be trustworthy? If it is trustworthy, what he says then is then universally applicable, and it's probably the only thing that truly is.
And that question is the question of theology. It is the question, it's really the only question of theology, and all the other questions are kind of little cues under that cue, right? Because like the history of theology, especially in the early centuries of the church, is constantly going back and asking the question, who is this Christ? Right. Is he the Gnostic Christ? Is he the Arian Christ? Is he the Jewish rabbi? Who is this Christ? And all the creeds. Is he
a mere carpenter who seemed to be really smart?
Yeah, all the other things that the theology does should serve that singular question that the church has written creeds over and everything else, which is, who is this Christ who is the way, the truth, and the life, and died on the cross? Because you can have a wrong answer to that.
Absolutely. Oh, for sure. And this is the point. This is the entire point. I mean, this is why doing a series like this is valuable, because you can see how every other thing that you hold as sort of almost as if you yourself are omniscient, true, is at best probable. when true, right? It's a proposition having to do with life, which means that you've trusted in some authority, if you gathered some evidence, whether you know you're gathering this evidence or not, and you've made a conclusion, but those conclusions are probabilities. This one, if the answer to this question of who was Christ is that he's true God, true man, begotten of the Father before all eternity, God of God, light of light, very God, do the whole thing. If he is that, then what he says is truth. And then what he says is also universally applicable. What he says then is, to use the phrase, meta.
Yeah. And also with that, I mean, if you look at the way that God enacts that story into the world, missions that were that meta narrative out through his church, it's still by faith. And so even Jesus, when he stood before Pilate and Pilate said, "What is truth?" and literally the truth was standing in front of him, or in front of Caiaphas, or in front of Herod, or in front of all the Jews with all the signs and the wonders, and Jews seek signs, and
or in front of his own
Greeks seek
disciple.
wisdom. In other words, there is no burden of proof that God can meet that someone can't say, "Well, I want more." That's what we see over and over again.
This is apologetically. I mean, this is the question of certainty apologetically, and this is what we cannot provide apart from faith.
Right, and this is why postmodernism is, and I'm not a true postmodern in the purest sense, but I do think this postmodernism has greatly been disparaged of, and I see it as a huge advantage to the church's witness in a lot of its parts. And one of those parts is postmodernism is able to say to the strict scientism, no, that we believe things on faith. We believe all sorts of things on faith because we're not God.
Well, at the same time, though, I'd respond to that, and then we probably have to. I'm sure we're past 15 minutes. There's faith, and then there's faith, right? There's faith that's reasonable and that is backed by evidence, and that takes that God-given faith to really get you to a type of certainty, and a heart, what the reformers called a heartfelt confidence. But not, what I worry about when we say faith is that people are going to think that means it's unreasonable. And I don't think it is. And I don't think the Christian faith is at all. I don't think the proposition that Christ is Lord is. But at the same time, I'm sympathetic to this idea that we desire certainty. We desire certainty, and we want that certainty apart from faith, right? We want the Christian faith to be like a mathematical equation, and it's just not. It's just because I lean this way again, I'm going to say it's more empirical in that sense. These are events that happened with real people to real people in time and in history, and have been reported by other people. That's open to investigation. That's not just an equation, but we're so much more, at least theoretically, comfortable with the equation type of certainty that when postmodernism comes along and says, "Well, you don't have that on many things," people are like, "Whoa, my gosh, well, of course I do." And I'm like, well, me, not even from a postmodern perspective, just from a more empirical perspective, saying, yeah, you probably don't actually have certainty on as many things as you think you do. You may have good evidence for them. That's a whole different ballgame, right? But yeah, I mean,
Scott, isn't maybe a simple way of putting this is there's the Christian faith is reasonable. When you look at all the evidence, you say that this faith is a reasonable faith. Reasonable faith is not the same as absolute certainty. In fact, a degree of certainty is not the same as absolute certainty.
Correct.
And so what we're not saying is that you can have what scientifically speaking, absolute certainty about dang near anything. But what you can have is a faith that is not foolish.
Yes.
Right?
You don't have to unscrew your skull cap, take out your brain, and set it on a drawer over here in order to be a Christian.
Right. Now,
it's not a requirement.
now. So as host, I'm gonna like hit pause because we're getting into certainty, and that's one of the questions we have going on is what is certainty? I think that the kind of goal, if you guys want to know what it is, at least as I see it, is to talk about some kind of big questions going forward. If you were like, man, this was really confusing, we're gonna get into some more like pinpoint questions that maybe will be easier to digest. But I think the goal, while talking about postmodernism and these questions, is to try to keep maybe the baby in the tub as we bail out the water, right? Does that sound fair, Bruce? Is that what we're trying to do here? Say, hey, there's some water that we could there's some bath water we could definitely get rid of, but it maybe the baby should stay in there.
I think it's fair. And I also think this, the question was, what is postmodernism? That's not a question that you get to answer without people scratching their heads as they're walking out the door, and it's sort of set up to be that way. Yeah. And so that's why, as insofar as our current culture is influenced by postmodernism, oftentimes people walk away from situations and conversations scratching their head for these same reasons. And one of the things I'm encouraged about is how much I think Bruce and I possibly agree on these topics. I'm also encouraged by how much we possibly disagree on them, which could make this series interesting.
Yeah. And you don't have to kill each other, which is nice.
We're too far away for that anyway.
Yeah, that's true. All right. Well, we will come back next time answering the question, are all beliefs equal, which will be followed by the question, what is certainty? So we will get to those two next.